The story of France, as we know it today, begins not with a sudden flourish, but with the slow, deliberate unraveling of a grand tapestry. The Roman Empire. Imagine, if you will, the twilight of the 5th century in what was then known as Gaul, a land of rolling vineyards, ancient forests, and bustling Roman cities, all under the distant yet pervasive shadow of Rome. For centuries, this vast territory, stretching from the Rhine to the Pyrenees, had been a jewel in the imperial crown, its people speaking Latin, its roads paved by Roman engineers, and its laws dictated from the Eternal City. But by the year 476 CE, the Western Roman Empire had officially collapsed, leaving behind a power vacuum, a patchwork of Romanized elites, and a growing tide of Germanic tribes who had long gazed with envy and sometimes admiration upon the fertile lands of Gaul. These tribes were not a monolithic force. They were a diverse collection of peoples, each with their own customs, languages, and ambitions. Among them, the Visigoths had carved out a powerful kingdom in the southwest, their capital at Toulouse. To the east, the Burgundians held sway in the Rhone Valley, while the Alemanni pressed at the Rhine frontier. And then there were the Franks, a confederation of Germanic groups who had, for generations, lived along the northern reaches of the Rhine, often serving as foederati, allies and mercenaries for the Romans, defending the very borders they would eventually cross and claim. They were a people of pragmatic warriors, known for their distinctive long hair and their fearsome throwing axe, the Francisca. The collapse of Roman authority didn't mean an immediate, cataclysmic end to Roman life. Instead, it was a gradual fading, like the last embers of a dying fire. Roman institutions, laws, and even the Latin language lingered, particularly in the cities. Bishops, often the most educated and respected figures in their communities, began to fill the void left by absent Roman governors, becoming de facto civic leaders. They were the custodians of Roman learning and, crucially, of the Christian faith, which had by this time largely supplanted the old pagan gods across Gaul. This blend of Roman heritage, Christian belief, and Germanic might would be the fertile soil from which Francia, the precursor to modern France, would grow. One figure stands out in this tumultuous period, a man whose ambition and cunning would irrevocably shape the future, Clovis I. Born around 466 CE, Clovis was a chieftain of the Salian Franks, one of the more prominent Frankish groups. His early life was likely spent in the traditional Frankish manner, leading his warriors in skirmishes and raids. But Clovis possessed a vision beyond mere plunder. He saw the fragmented landscape of Gaul not as a collection of independent entities, but as a territory ripe for unification under a single, strong hand. His first major conquest came in 486 CE, when he defeated Syagrius, the last Roman ruler in Gaul, at the Battle of Soissons. This victory was more than just a territorial gain. It was a symbolic severing of the last ties to Roman imperial rule in the region. The story of the Vase of Soissons, where Clovis famously demonstrated his authority over his own warriors by striking down a defiant soldier, illustrates his nascent power and his determination to establish a new order. Clovis's reign was a whirlwind of military campaigns and strategic alliances. He systematically expanded his territory, often through brutal warfare against other Frankish tribes, the Alemanni and the Visigoths. But his most significant move, one that would have profound and lasting consequences for the development of France and indeed for Western Europe, was his conversion to Nicene Christianity. Around 496 CE, after a pivotal victory against the Alemanni at the Battle of Tolbiac, a victory he attributed to the Christian God, much like Constantine before him. Clovis was baptized by Saint R. Remigius, the Bishop of Reims. This was not merely a personal spiritual decision, it was a political masterstroke. Most of the other Germanic tribes who had settled in Gaul, such as the Visigoths and Burgundians, were Arian Christians, a branch of Christianity considered heretical by the Roman Catholic Church. By embracing Nicene Christianity, Clovis gained the crucial support of the Gallo-Roman aristocracy and, more importantly, the powerful Catholic Church, which saw him as a champion against heresy. This alliance between the Frankish monarchy and the Church would become a defining characteristic of medieval French history, shaping its culture, laws, and political landscape for centuries to come. With the Church's blessing and a growing army, Clovis continued his conquests. He pushed the Visigoths south of the Loire in 507 CE, effectively confining them to Hispania after the Battle of Vouillé, a victory that further solidified his control over much of Gaul. By the time of his death in 511 CE, Clovis had united most of the Frankish tribes and brought a vast swathe of Gaul under his rule, establishing the Merovingian dynasty, named after his semi-mythical ancestor Merovech. He was, in essence, the founder of Francia, though the concept of a unified France was still many centuries away. The Merovingian era, which followed Clovis, is often characterized as a period of decline and fragmentation, sometimes dubbed the Dark Ages by earlier historians, though modern scholarship paints a more nuanced picture. Upon Clovis's death, his kingdom, in accordance with Frankish custom, was divided among his 4 sons. This practice of partible inheritance, where the kingdom was treated as personal property to be split among heirs, would plague the Merovingians for generations, leading to incessant civil wars and shifting borders. The map of Francia became a kaleidoscope of changing allegiances and temporary unions, with powerful regional subkingdoms like Neustria, roughly northern France, Austrasia, the northeastern parts, including the Rhine basin, and Burgundy often vying for supremacy. Despite the political instability, the Merovingian period was not without its achievements. It was a time of significant cultural synthesis, where Roman traditions, Germanic customs, and Christian doctrines slowly began to intertwine. Latin remained the language of administration and the church, but it gradually evolved into Vulgar Latin, laying the groundwork for the Romance languages, including Old French. Monasteries, often founded by Irish or Anglo-Saxon missionaries, became vital centers of learning, preserving classical texts and fostering artistic endeavors. The illuminated manuscripts produced in these scriptoria, with their intricate interlace patterns and vibrant colors, are a testament to a sophisticated artistic tradition that flourished even amidst political turmoil. One of the more intriguing aspects of Merovingian society, and a point of scholarly debate, concerns the actual power wielded by the later Merovingian kings. After a succession of strong rulers following Clovis, the dynasty gradually saw its power wane. The kings, often depicted as roi fainéants or do-nothing kings, became increasingly ceremonial figures. Their long hair, a symbol of their sacred royalty, perhaps their most distinguishing feature. The real power began to shift to the mayors of the palace, high-ranking officials who managed the royal household and, increasingly, the affairs of the kingdom. Historians still debate whether this decline in royal power was due to a series of weak kings, the inherent flaws in the system of partible inheritance, or the deliberate usurpation of authority by ambitious mayors of the palace. Some argue that the kings were not as inactive as later Carolingian propaganda portrayed them, but rather that their power was simply more decentralized and exercised through regional magnates. Nevertheless, the rise of the mayors of the palace is undeniable. By the 7th century, families like the Pippinids, who would later become the Carolingians, began to consolidate their influence, often acting as regents for child kings or exercising military command. These powerful officials effectively controlled the Frankish armies, dispensed justice, and managed royal lands, leaving the kings with little more than their titles and their iconic long locks. The image of the king being paraded in an ox cart, a symbol of his diminished status, is a powerful, if perhaps exaggerated, portrayal of this shift in power. The Merovingian legacy, therefore, is complex. It was a period of both destruction and creation, of fragmentation and the slow forging of a new identity. The foundations laid by Clovis, a unified Frankish kingdom, an alliance with the Catholic Church, and the gradual assimilation of Roman and Germanic cultures would prove enduring. The constant struggle for power among the Merovingian heirs, while destabilizing, also fostered a dynamic political landscape that prevented any single region from dominating entirely, allowing for a diverse cultural development across Francia. The very idea of a French identity, distinct from Roman or purely Germanic, began to slowly coalesce during these centuries, a subtle shift in the collective consciousness of the inhabitants of Gaul. The gradual transition from a Roman province to a collection of Frankish kingdoms was a messy, often violent process, but it was also a crucible in which the elements of a future nation were slowly fused together. The echoes of Roman law, the fervent spread of Christianity, and the martial traditions of the Franks all contributed to this nascent identity. The winding rivers and ancient forests of Gaul, once traversed by Roman legions, now bore witness to the clatter of Frankish warriors and the quiet prayers of monks, all contributing to the rich tapestry of early medieval Francia. If you're enjoying this, make sure to subscribe and leave in the comments the time and place you're listening from. The echoes of Clovis's ambition, though faint, resonated through the Frankish lands for centuries, a complex tapestry woven with threads of conquest, conversion, and consolidation. Yet, as the Merovingian line grew increasingly weak, their power became more symbolic than substantial. The true reins of governance slipped into the hands of a new class of powerful officials, the mayors of the palace. These were not mere administrators, they were the architects of a new destiny, building their own power base while the do-nothing kings of the Merovingians receded into the gilded shadows of their courts. It was from this fertile ground of shifting power that the Carolingian dynasty would emerge, their name forever linked to the most towering figure of the early Middle Ages, Charlemagne. But before Charlemagne, there was Charles Martel, a name that still rings with the clang of steel and the roar of battle. In 732 AD, at the Battle of Tours, Charles Martel, the then mayor of the palace, faced an invading Umayyad army that had swept across the Iberian Peninsula and threatened to engulf Gaul. This was a pivotal moment, a clash of civilizations that historians still debate the full implications of. Was it, as some argue, the decisive battle that saved Christian Europe from Islamic conquest? Or was it a significant, but not entirely existential struggle? Regardless, Martel's victory solidified his family's prestige and power. laying the groundwork for his descendants to claim the crown itself. His son, Pepin the Short, would complete this transformation. With the blessing of the Pope, who sought a powerful ally against the Lombards in Italy, Pepin deposed the last Merovingian king, Childeric III, in 751 AD. The act was audacious, a clear statement that divine right now flowed through deeds and military might. Not just ancient lineage. Pepin was anointed king, a sacred ritual that imbued his reign with religious legitimacy and forged a powerful alliance between the Frankish monarchy and the papacy. A relationship that would shape European history for centuries. This was a subtle but profound shift. The king was no longer just a warrior chieftain, but a divinely chosen ruler, a protector of the church. Pepin's reign was marked by further consolidation and expansion. But it was his son, Charles, who would truly ignite the Frankish star. Born around 742 AD, Charles, later known as Charlemagne or Charles the Great, inherited a kingdom poised for greatness. From the moment he ascended to the throne in 768 AD, he embarked on a series of relentless military campaigns that would expand the Frankish realm into an empire stretching across much of Western Europe. For over 3 decades, Charlemagne waged war. Not just for conquest, but for the expansion of Christianity and the establishment of order. He subdued the Lombards in Italy, incorporating their kingdom into his own. He campaigned tirelessly against the Saxons, a Germanic pagan people, forcing their conversion to Christianity, often through brutal means, a stark reminder of the era's harsh realities. He pushed back the Avars, a nomadic people from the east, and established a buffer zone in what is now Austria. Imagine the sheer scale of these endeavours. The logistical challenges of moving armies across vast, often untamed landscapes. The clash of cultures and languages. Charlemagne was a man of immense energy and vision, a towering figure both physically and intellectually. He was said to be tall and robust, with a keen intellect and a thirst for knowledge. He surrounded himself with scholars and artists, fostering a cultural and intellectual revival known as the Carolingian Renaissance. This was a period of renewed interest in classical learning, the standardization of Latin, and the flourishing of monastic scriptoria where ancient texts were copied and preserved. Monasteries became centers of learning, their libraries growing with precious manuscripts, their scribes meticulously illustrating. Illuminating pages with intricate designs. One of Charlemagne's most enduring legacies was his administrative reforms. He divided his vast empire into counties, each governed by a count, and appointed special envoys, the missi dominici, to travel throughout the realm, overseeing justice and ensuring loyalty. These missi, often a bishop and a lay lord, acted as the king's eyes and ears, reporting directly back to Charlemagne, a system designed to prevent local lords from becoming too powerful and independent. He also standardized coinage, weights, and measures, fostering trade and economic stability across his diverse territories. His efforts to create a unified legal system, though never fully realized, laid the groundwork for future legal developments. The pinnacle of Charlemagne's reign came on Christmas Day, 800 AD, in Rome. As he knelt in prayer at St. Peter's Basilica, Pope Leo III placed a crown upon his head, proclaiming him Emperor of the Romans. This moment, though carefully orchestrated, was a profound declaration. It symbolically resurrected the Western Roman Empire, asserting a new imperial authority in Europe and forever linking the Frankish monarchy to the legacy of Rome. It also complicated relations with the Byzantine Empire in the east, who considered themselves the rightful heirs to the Roman tradition. Historians still debate the true motivations behind this coronation. Was it a genuine attempt to revive a unified Christian empire, or a strategic move by the Pope to assert his own authority over secular rulers? Perhaps it was a blend of both, a moment of profound political and religious symbolism that resonated deeply across the continent. Charlemagne's empire, at its zenith, was a beacon of order and learning in a turbulent age. He established schools, encouraged literacy, and promoted the arts. He himself, despite his immense power, was said to have struggled with writing, learning to read later in life, a testament to his dedication to self-improvement and intellectual pursuit. His court at Aachen became a vibrant center of culture, drawing scholars and artisans from across Europe. The Palatine Chapel in Aachen, with its octagonal design and intricate mosaics, stands today as a magnificent testament to Carolingian architectural ambition, a deliberate echo of Byzantine grandeur. Yet, even the greatest empires are mortal, and Charlemagne's would prove no exception. The seeds of its dissolution were sown even before his death in 814 AD. His empire, though vast, lacked the strong institutional infrastructure of the old Roman Empire. It was held together largely by his personal charisma, military prowess, and the loyalty of his vassals. The Frankish tradition of partible inheritance, where a father's lands were divided among his sons, also posed a constant threat to unity. Upon Charlemagne's death, his son Louis the Pious inherited the entire empire. Louis was a devout and well-intentioned ruler, but he lacked his father's military genius and political acumen. His reign was plagued by internal strife, primarily conflicts with his own sons over the division of the empire. These dynastic squabbles weakened the central authority and fueled regional ambitions. The unity forged by Charlemagne began to fray under the weight of internal divisions and external pressures, particularly from Viking raids that were becoming increasingly frequent and devastating along the coasts and rivers of Europe. The inevitable fragmentation came to a head after Louis the Pious's death in 840 AD. His three surviving sons, Lothair, Louis the German, and Charles the Bald, engaged in a brutal civil war for control of the empire. The conflict culminated in the Treaty of Verdun in 843 AD, a landmark agreement that formally divided Charlemagne's vast realm into three distinct kingdoms. Lothair, the eldest, received the Middle Frankish Kingdom, a long, narrow strip of territory stretching from the Low Countries down through Italy. Along with the imperial title, Louis the German was granted the East Frankish Kingdom, which would eventually evolve into the Holy Roman Empire. Charles the Bald received the West Frankish Kingdom, the precursor to modern France. Imagine the map of Europe being redrawn, not by lines on paper, but by the clash of armies and the solemn oaths of brothers. The Treaty of Verdun was more than just a division of land. It marked the beginning of distinct political and cultural identities that would eventually coalesce into the nations we recognize today. The West Frankish Kingdom, under Charles the Bald, began to develop its own unique character, distinct from its Eastern and Middle counterparts. Its language, Old French, began to diverge more sharply from the Germanic tongues spoken to the east. Its political structures, though still heavily influenced by Carolingian traditions, started to adapt to local conditions and regional power dynamics. The dissolution did not stop with Verdun. Lothair's Middle Kingdom, lacking natural borders and a cohesive identity, quickly fragmented further upon his death. The imperial title became a contested prize, often held by weak rulers with little real power. The political landscape of Europe became a patchwork of smaller, often warring, kingdoms and principalities. The once mighty Carolingian Empire, a fleeting moment of unity and grandeur, had dissolved into a mosaic of nascent states. This period of fragmentation, however, was not one of unmitigated decline. While central authority weakened, local lords gained power, building castles and establishing their own spheres of influence. This decentralized power structure, while leading to instability, also fostered the development of distinct regional cultures and institutions. The legacy of Charlemagne, though his empire had crumbled, continued to inspire. His vision of a unified Christian Europe, his promotion of learning, and his administrative innovations left an indelible mark on the political, cultural, and religious landscape of the continent. The Carolingian Renaissance had preserved classical knowledge and laid the groundwork for future intellectual flourishing. The West Frankish Kingdom, the direct ancestor of France, faced its own unique challenges. Viking raids continued to plague its coasts and rivers, forcing kings to grant land to powerful regional magnates in exchange for military service and defense. This further strengthened the hand of local lords and contributed to the rise of feudalism, a system where land was exchanged for loyalty and military service. The kings of the West Franks, though theoretically supreme, often struggled to assert their authority over their powerful vassals. The dream of a unified, centrally controlled kingdom, so briefly realized under Charlemagne, receded into the mists of a turbulent future. Yet within this fragmentation, the seeds of a new identity were slowly taking root. The people of the West Frankish Kingdom, sharing a common language and increasingly distinct customs, began to see themselves as different from their eastern neighbors. The geographical boundaries established by the Treaty of Verdun, though initially arbitrary, began to shape a sense of shared destiny. The rivers, the forests, the coastlines, these natural features, once mere conduits for armies, now began to define the nascent borders of a future nation. The echoes of Charlemagne's grand vision might have faded, but the foundations he laid, however indirectly, would eventually support the rise of a new, distinct kingdom, France. The long, slow process of nation-building, a journey through centuries of conflict, alliance, and cultural evolution, had truly begun. The memory of a unified empire might have lingered, a wistful whisper on the wind, but the reality was now a diverse tapestry of emerging identities, each vying for its place in the unfolding narrative of Europe. The last echoes of Carolingian glory faded with Louis V, a king whose reign was so brief and ineffectual that chroniclers often referred to him as le fainéant, the do-nothing. His death in 987, without a direct heir, plunged the fragile kingdom of West Francia into a succession crisis. The great lords, ever watchful, saw an opportunity, but also a danger. For decades, the Robertian family, powerful counts of Paris and dukes of the Franks, had been a counterweight to the declining Carolingians. Their strength lay not in ancient lineage, but in their strategic holdings around Paris and Orléans, and their consistent ability to defend against Viking incursions, a feat the later Carolingians often struggled with. It was in this turbulent landscape that Hugh Capet, a descendant of this very Robertian line, was elected king. The Archbishop Adalberon of Reims, a shrewd political operator, championed Hugh's cause at an assembly of nobles in Senlis. Adalberon argued passionately that the crown should go not to the man of noblest birth, but to the man most capable of governing. This was a radical departure from the long-held principle of hereditary succession, a pragmatic choice born of necessity. Hugh, already a powerful duke, promised stability. He was crowned in Noyon on July 3rd, 987, marking the official beginning of the Capetian dynasty, a line that would, in various branches, rule France for over 800 years. Hugh Capet's kingdom, however, was a king's kingdom in name only. His direct authority barely extended beyond his own personal domain, the lands he controlled as Duke of the Franks, which stretched from Paris to Orléans. Beyond these borders, powerful feudal lords, the Dukes of Normandy, Burgundy, Aquitaine and Brittany, the Counts of Flanders, Anjou, and Toulouse, ruled their territories with near absolute autonomy. They minted their own coins, raised their own armies, administered their own justice, and often waged war against each other with little regard for the distant Capetian king. The early Capetians were, in essence, little more than glorified territorial princes, often less powerful than some of their own vassals. Historians still debate the exact extent of Hugh's actual power. Some argue he was a mere figurehead, while others point to his strategic marriage alliances and the symbolic weight of his coronation as evidence of a nascent, if fragile, authority. Hugh understood the precariousness of his position. His immediate priority was to ensure the continuity of his dynasty. Just a few months after his own coronation, he shrewdly arranged for the coronation of his eldest son, Robert, as co-king. This practice, known as the associate kingship, became a hallmark of early Capetian rule. It served two crucial purposes. It bypassed the unpredictable process of noble election upon the king's death, effectively establishing a hereditary monarchy, and it provided a clear line of succession, reducing the chances of internecine conflict among the great lords vying for the throne. This simple act of foresight laid the groundwork for centuries of Capetian rule. Robert II, known as the Pious, succeeded his father in 996. His reign was marked by a deep religiosity, but also by a pragmatic approach to consolidating power. He was a learned man, well versed in theology and law, and maintained a close relationship with the Church, which became a crucial ally for the Capetian kings. The Church, with its vast lands, intellectual resources, and moral authority, provided a framework for order in a fragmented world. Robert sought to expand the royal domain through both diplomacy and, when necessary, military force. He incorporated the Duchy of Burgundy into the royal domain through a complex series of negotiations and inheritances, a significant expansion of Capetian influence. He also faced challenges from powerful vassals, particularly the Counts of Blois and Anjou, whose ongoing feuds often threatened to destabilize the Regio. No, Robert, despite his pious nature, was not above engaging in warfare to assert his rights or protect his interests. One of the more curious episodes of Robert's reign involved his excommunication by Pope Gregory V. Robert had married Bertha of Burgundy, a distant cousin, but also his godmother, a union deemed incestuous by the Church. Despite his deep piety, Robert stubbornly refused to annul the marriage for many years, leading to his excommunication. This event highlights the complex interplay between secular and ecclesiastical power in the medieval era. Even a pious king could find himself at odds with the Pope, and the threat of spiritual damnation was a potent political weapon. Eventually, under immense pressure, Robert relented and divorced Bertha, marrying Constance of Arles, a woman of fiery temperament who would bring her own set of challenges to the royal court. The early Capetian kings, from Hugh to Robert and his successors, Henry I and Philip I, faced a daunting task. Their kingdom was not a unified entity, but a patchwork of semi-independent lordships. Their power was more symbolic than real, their treasury often meagre, and their army small, reliant on the unpredictable loyalty of their vassals. Yet they possessed several key advantages. The very weakness of the central authority meant that the great lords, while powerful, were often preoccupied with their own local struggles. They rarely united against the king, and when they did, their alliances were often short-lived. The Capetians also benefited from the enduring mystique of kingship. Despite their limited power, they were still anointed by God, the direct successors of Charlemagne, and the symbolic head of the kingdom. This provided a moral authority that no mere count or duke could claim. The royal court, though itinerant and modest, served as a centre of justice and appeal, drawing litigants from across the realm, slowly but steadily extending the king's influence. Perhaps one of the most overlooked aspects of early Capetian consolidation was their consistent focus on the royal domain. While other lords were building vast, sprawling territories, often through conquest and marriage, the Capetians concentrated on making their own lands, the Ile de France, prosperous and well-governed. Paris and Orléans became centres of trade, learning, and administration. The stability and relative peace within the royal domain contrasted sharply with the often turbulent lands of their vassals. This created a powerful economic and administrative base from which they could slowly project their power outwards. The wealth generated from their domain allowed them to hire mercenaries, build fortifications, and fund their increasingly sophisticated administration. A stark contrast to the earlier Carolingians, who often relied on the goodwill of their powerful counts. Henry I, who reigned from 1031 to 1060, continued the slow, painstaking work of his predecessors. He faced numerous challenges, including revolts from his own vassals and external threats from the Holy Roman Empire. He was forced to cede the Duchy of Burgundy to his brother Robert, a strategic move to quell a family dispute, but also a temporary setback for royal expansion. However, he also engaged in strategic alliances, notably with the Duke of Normandy, William the Conqueror, before William's invasion of England. This alliance, though ultimately short-lived and turning to rivalry, demonstrates the complex web of relationships the Capetians had to navigate. Henry, like his father, continued the practice of associate kingship, crowning his son Philip as co-king in 1059. This ensured a smooth transition of power upon his death. Philip I, who ruled from 1060 to 1108, inherited a kingdom still largely fragmented. His reign coincided with momentous changes in Europe, most notably the Norman conquest of England in 1066. This event, initially seen as a potential threat by the French king, ultimately proved to be a long-term boon for the Capetians. The Duke of Normandy, now King of England, became a vassal of the French crown, albeit a far more powerful one than his lord. This created a complex dynamic. The English kings, as Dukes of Normandy and later Aquitaine, owed homage to the French king, yet they commanded greater resources and prestige. This rivalry would define Anglo-French relations for centuries. But it also elevated the symbolic importance of the French crown as the ultimate feudal overlord. Philip I was a pragmatic and often opportunistic ruler. He focused on expanding the royal domains through strategic acquisitions, often by exploiting the weaknesses or disputes of his vassals. He bought lands, seized others through forfeiture, and skillfully managed inheritances. He also faced his own excommunication, this time for his scandalous marriage to Bertrade de Montfort, who was already married to the Count of Anjou. This second royal excommunication within a century further illustrates the ongoing tension between secular and ecclesiastical authority, and the personal struggles even powerful kings faced in a deeply religious age. Under Philip I, the royal administration began to slowly professionalize. He appointed more educated clerks and administrators, often drawn from the growing urban centers rather than relying solely on the landed nobility. These men, loyal to the king rather than a particular region, formed the nascent bureaucracy that would become a hallmark of later Capetian rule. They helped manage the royal finances, administer justice, and collect taxes, steadily increasing the efficiency and reach of royal power. The early Capetians, from Hugh to Philip I, were not grand conquerors. Their reigns were not marked by sweeping military victories or dramatic territorial expansion. Instead, their success lay in their patient, persistent, and often subtle efforts to consolidate power. They understood the long game. They focused on three key strategies: securing the succession through associate kingship, building a strong and prosperous royal domain, and cultivating alliances, particularly with the church. They also skillfully exploited the inherent fragmentation of the feudal system, playing one vassal against another, and slowly weaving a web of loyalty and obligation that centered, however tenuously, on the Capetian throne. The landscape of West Francia in the 11th century was a tapestry of shifting allegiances and localized power. Castles, symbols of feudal authority, dotted the countryside, each a miniature kingdom unto itself. The lives of most people were bound to the land, their existence dictated by the rhythms of agriculture and the demands of their local lord. Yet even in this decentralized world, the idea of a king, a central authority, persisted. The Capetians, through their quiet determination, nurtured this idea, allowing it to grow from a fragile seed into a deep-rooted tree. The kings themselves often traveled throughout their limited domain, holding court, hearing petitions, and dispensing justice. These royal progresses, though modest compared to later eras, served to make the king a visible presence, a tangible symbol of justice and order in a turbulent world. Imagine the arrival of the royal retinue in a small village or town. The banners, the knights, the clerks, all signifying a power beyond the local count or baron. For many, it was a rare glimpse of a wider world, a connection to a larger, albeit distant, realm. The gradual strengthening of the Capetian monarchy was not a linear process, nor was it inevitable. There were setbacks, rebellions, and periods of weakness, but the consistent focus on hereditary succession, the careful management of the royal domain, and the strategic use of ecclesiastical and feudal law slowly but surely tipped the balance of power. By the end of Philip I's reign, the Capetian kings were still far from absolute monarchs, but their position was undeniably more secure than that of Hugh Capet. The foundations had been laid, brick by painstaking brick, for the future growth of the French monarchy. The seed planted in 987 was beginning to sprout, its roots slowly intertwining with the very soil of France. The long, slow work of centralization had begun, a process that would define the next several centuries of French history. The 11th century dawned, still shadowed by the echoes of Viking longships and the fragmented power of local lords. Yet a new energy began to stir across the lands that would become France. It was an age of rising populations, of agricultural innovation that slowly, painstakingly transformed wild forests into tilled fields, and of burgeoning towns that drew people from the countryside with the promise of trade and a different kind of freedom. Amidst this slow, organic growth, a powerful spiritual current began to flow, one that would sweep across the continent and forever alter the landscape of Europe: the Crusades. The call came from Pope Urban II in the year 1095 at the Council of Clermont, a town nestled in the heart of Auvergne. Before a vast assembly of clergy and nobles, he painted a vivid, harrowing picture of Christian pilgrims suffering in the Holy Land, of sacred sites desecrated, and of the need to reclaim Jerusalem from Seljuk Turkish control. His words, delivered with fervent conviction, ignited a spark that had been smouldering for decades. A mix of piety, martial zeal, and perhaps, for some, the lure of adventure and new lands. Deus vult, God wills it, became the rallying cry, echoing through the valleys and over the hills, drawing knights, peasants, and even women and children into a movement of unprecedented scale. The First Crusade, launched in 1096, was a chaotic, often brutal affair, a testament to both extraordinary faith and human fallibility. French nobles, particularly from the south, played a pivotal role. Raymond IV of Toulouse, Godfrey of Bouillon, though technically from Lower Lorraine, his cultural ties were strong, and Bohemond of Taranto, a Norman from southern Italy, led armies across vast, unfamiliar landscapes. They faced unimaginable hardships: disease, starvation, skirmishes with local populations, and the sheer logistical nightmare of moving tens of thousands of people across thousands of miles. Yet, against all odds, they achieved their objective, capturing Jerusalem in 1099, an event that sent shockwaves across both the Christian and Islamic worlds. The establishment of the Crusader states in the Levant, fragile outposts of Western power in a predominantly Eastern land, marked a new chapter in the relationship between Europe and the Middle East. This initial success, however, was not without its complexities. The Crusader states, like the Kingdom of Jerusalem and the Principality of Antioch, were perpetually vulnerable, dependent on a continuous flow of new recruits and resources from Europe. This need fueled subsequent crusades, each with its own character and outcome. The Second Crusade, 1147 to 1149, for instance, saw Louis VII of France, a devout but perhaps less militarily astute monarch, join forces with Emperor Conrad III of Germany. Their efforts, largely unsuccessful, highlighted the growing difficulties of maintaining these distant territories. The Third Crusade, 1189 to 1192, often remembered for the epic clashes between Richard the Lionheart and Saladin, also involved Philip II Augustus of France. Though Philip returned home early, citing illness and pressing matters in France, his participation underscored the enduring commitment of French monarchs to the crusading ideal, even as their focus slowly began to shift back to consolidating power within their own borders. The Crusades were more than just military expeditions. They were conduits for cultural exchange, however fraught. Returning crusaders brought back new goods, spices, silks, new agricultural techniques, and new ideas. They encountered sophisticated Islamic scholarship, architecture, and medicine, which, though often viewed with suspicion, undeniably contributed to the intellectual ferment of medieval Europe. The very concept of chivalry, though rooted in earlier martial traditions, was refined and romanticized in the context of the Crusades, emphasizing courage, honor, and religious devotion. While Knight's journey eastward, back in France, another grand ambition was taking shape: the construction of the Gothic cathedral. These soaring structures, marvels of engineering and artistic expression, were the physical embodiment of the age's spiritual fervor and its growing prosperity. From the mid-12th century onwards, a veritable explosion of cathedral building transformed the skylines of French cities. Think of the delicate yet monumental grandeur of Chartres, the intricate facades of Reims, or the sheer scale of Notre Dame de Paris. These weren't merely places of worship. They were community hubs, centers of learning, and powerful symbols of urban pride and ecclesiastical authority. The architectural innovations that made Gothic possible were revolutionary. The pointed arch, the ribbed vault, and crucially, the flying buttress allowed walls to be thinner and taller, supporting immense weight while opening up vast expanses for stained glass windows. These windows, shimmering tapestries of colored light, told biblical stories to a largely illiterate populace, flooding the interiors with an ethereal glow that must have seemed truly divine. The construction of a single cathedral could take decades, even centuries, involving generations of master masons, stone carvers, glaziers, and countless laborers. It was a communal effort, often funded by royal patronage, noble donations, and the contributions of ordinary citizens, all united by a shared vision of creating a heavenly space on earth. The sheer audacity of these projects, the meticulous craftsmanship, and the profound theological symbolism embedded in every stone and pane of glass speak volumes about the medieval worldview. They were prayers in stone, reaching towards the heavens, reflecting a society deeply imbued with faith. Historians still debate the precise origins of the Gothic style, with some pointing to the Abbey of Saint Denis, meticulously rebuilt by Abbot Suger in the mid-12th century as a pivotal early example. Suger's vision of light and transcendence, expressed through innovative architectural forms, certainly influenced the rapid spread of the style across France and beyond. Simultaneously with these grand spiritual and architectural endeavors, the French monarchy was engaged in a more terrestrial yet equally ambitious project: the expansion and consolidation of royal power. For centuries, the Capetian kings, though theoretically rulers of France, had exercised direct control over only a relatively small domain, primarily the Île-de-France around Paris and Orléans. The rest of the kingdom was a patchwork of powerful, semi-independent duchies and counties, whose loyalty was often nominal and whose resources were their own. The turning point arguably came with Louis VI, known as Louis the Fat, reigned 1108 to 1137. He dedicated his reign to bringing order to the royal domain, systematically subduing rebellious castellans and asserting his authority over the unruly lords who plagued his immediate territories. He was a practical, energetic king, often leading his own troops into battle. His efforts, though focused locally, laid the groundwork for his successors to expand their reach. His son, Louis VII, reigned 1137 to 1180, faced a different kind of challenge. His marriage to Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the wealthiest and most powerful women in Europe, briefly brought vast territories in the southwest under Capetian influence. However, their tempestuous marriage ended in annulment in 1152, and Eleanor swiftly married Henry Plantagenet, Duke of Normandy and Count of Anjou, who soon became King Henry II of England. This union created the Angevin Empire, a vast collection of lands stretching from Scotland to the Pyrenees, far outstripping the French king's direct holdings. For the next century, the struggle against the English Plantagenets became the defining foreign policy challenge for the French monarchy, a relentless contest for territory and sovereignty. It was Philip II Augustus, reigned 1180 to 1223, truly transformed the fortunes of the French crown. A shrewd politician and a formidable military commander, Philip Augustus understood that to be a true king of France, he needed to dismantle the Angevin Empire and incorporate its French territories into his own domain. He was patient, cunning, and ruthless when necessary. His great triumph came at the Battle of Bouvines in 1214, where he decisively defeated a coalition of English, German, and Flemish forces. This victory was monumental. It allowed him to annex Normandy, Anjou, Maine, and Touraine, dramatically expanding the royal domain and weakening the English hold on continental Europe. Philip Augustus was not just a conqueror, he was an administrator. He reorganized the royal administration, creating a more efficient bureaucracy with baillis and seneschaux to govern the newly acquired territories and collect royal revenues. He invested in Paris, paving streets, building new markets, and constructing the Louvre as a fortress, transforming it into a true capital city. His reign marked a significant shift from a feudal monarchy, where the king was merely the first among equals, to a more centralized, powerful state. The royal seal, once a simple symbol, now carried the weight of a growing, unified kingdom. The legacy of Philip Augustus was continued by his grandson, Louis IX, reigned 1226 to 1270, later canonized as Saint Louis. Louis was a deeply pious man, renowned for his justice, charity, and commitment to peace. Yet he was also a strong and effective ruler who further consolidated royal authority. He introduced important legal reforms, establishing royal courts that offered a more impartial justice than local feudal lords. He outlawed private wars between nobles within his domain and issued ordinances that applied across the kingdom, a significant step towards a unified legal system. Louis IX's piety led him to embark on two crusades, the 7th and 8th, both of which ended in failure and his own capture and eventual death in Tunisia during the latter. Despite these military setbacks, his moral authority and reputation for fairness enhanced the prestige of the French monarchy, both at home and abroad. He was seen as a model Christian king, and his reign is often considered a golden age of medieval France, a period of relative peace, prosperity, and cultural flourishing. The 13th century, in particular, witnessed a remarkable intellectual blossoming. The universities of Paris, Montpellier, and Orléans became renowned centers of learning, attracting scholars from across Europe. The University of Paris, in particular, with its focus on theology and philosophy, became a beacon of scholasticism, where figures like Thomas Aquinas grappled with the synthesis of Christian doctrine and Aristotelian thought. The vibrant intellectual life, coupled with the burgeoning Gothic cathedrals, created a rich cultural tapestry that defined the High Middle Ages in France. However, even in this era of expanding royal power and cultural brilliance, the seeds of future conflict were being sown. A very success of the French kings in consolidating their domain often came at the expense of powerful regional lords, whose ambitions and independence were slowly being eroded. The long-standing rivalry with England, though temporarily subdued after Bouvines, was far from over. The English kings, still holding Gascony in the southwest, would continue to press their claims, leading to centuries of intermittent warfare. Moreover, the growing power of the monarchy also brought it into increasing tension with the church, particularly over issues of taxation and jurisdiction. While St. Louis maintained a harmonious relationship with the papacy, later kings like Philip IV the Fair, reigned 1285 to 1314, would engage in direct confrontations, even going so far as to attempt to arrest a pope, a dramatic assertion of royal supremacy over ecclesiastica. In authority, the High Middle Ages, then, was a period of profound transformation for the lands of France. It was an era of fervent faith that built colossal cathedrals and launched ambitious crusades. It was a time when the Capetian kings, through a combination of military prowess, shrewd diplomacy, and administrative innovation, began to forge a coherent kingdom from a fragmented feudal landscape. The echoes of Deus Vult and the intricate carvings of gargoyles on towering spires tell of a society striving for both spiritual salvation and earthly dominion, laying the foundations for the modern French state, brick by painstaking brick, and prayer by fervent prayer. The tapestry of medieval France, woven with threads of piety, power, and artistic genius, was becoming ever richer, ever more complex, yet still, in its heart, deeply rooted in the soil of its ancient past. The tapestry of France, woven with threads of fragmented feudalism, began to gather itself into a more coherent whole under the reign of a king whose very name seemed to promise a brighter future, Philip Augustus. Born in 1165, he ascended the throne in 1180, a young man with a keen intellect and an unyielding will, destined to reshape the destiny of his kingdom. He inherited a crown that, while theoretically powerful, held sway over a patchwork of semi-independent duchies and counties, many of which were richer and more powerful than the royal domain itself. His early years were a careful dance of diplomacy and strategic marriages, slowly consolidating his power. But it was his long and often bitter struggle with the English Plantagenets that truly defined his reign and laid the foundations for a unified France. The Plantagenet kings, particularly Henry II and his sons, Richard the Lionheart and John, held vast swathes of French territory: Normandy, Anjou, Maine, Touraine, Poitou, and Aquitaine. These lands, often referred to as the Angevin Empire, dwarfed Philip's own royal domain and presented a constant challenge to his authority. Philip, a master of political maneuvering, understood that to truly establish the French monarchy's supremacy, he needed to dismantle this formidable English presence. He exploited the frequent quarrels within the Plantagenet family, subtly fanning the flames of discontent between Henry II and his rebellious sons. The stage was set for a dramatic confrontation, and it arrived with the disastrous reign of King John of England. John, known for his capricious nature and military ineptitude, provided Philip with the perfect opportunity. In 1202, following a dispute over feudal obligations, Philip declared John's French fiefs forfeit. This bold move ignited a series of campaigns that would prove decisive. Philip, a methodical and patient commander, systematically conquered Normandy, Anjou, Maine, and Touraine between 1202 and 1204. The fall of Château Gaillard, a formidable fortress built by Richard the Lionheart in 1204, marked a symbolic turning point. Normandy, a land that had been under English rule for over a century and a half, was now firmly back in French hands. This was a monumental achievement, dramatically expanding the royal domain and significantly diminishing the Plantagenet threat. The Battle of Bouvines in 1214 stands as one of the most important battles in French history, a testament to Philip's military prowess and strategic vision. Facing a formidable coalition led by King John, Emperor Otto IV, and the Count of Flanders, Philip's victory was a resounding affirmation of French strength. The battle solidified his territorial gains and severely weakened his adversaries, effectively ending the Plantagenet ambition to reclaim their lost French territories. It was a moment of profound national pride, fostering a sense of shared identity among the disparate peoples of France. Historians still debate the precise tactical decisions made by Philip that day. But his ability to unite his forces and achieve such a decisive victory against a larger, well-equipped enemy remains a subject of admiration. Perhaps the very dust of that battlefield still whispers tales of the French cavalry's charge and the emperor's desperate flight. Beyond military conquest, Philip Augustus was a shrewd administrator. He recognized that a strong kingdom required more than just land. It needed efficient governance. He reformed the royal administration, establishing a more centralized bureaucracy. He appointed royal officials, known as baillis and sénéchaux, to administer justice and collect taxes in the newly acquired territories, extending royal authority into areas that had previously enjoyed considerable autonomy. He also focused on developing Paris, transforming it into a true capital. He paved its streets, built the first wall around the city, and initiated the construction of the Louvre fortress, which will evolve into the magnificent palace. He also granted a royal charter to the University of Paris, solidifying its reputation as a leading center of learning in Europe. This period saw the flourishing of scholasticism, with figures like Peter Abelard having already laid intellectual foundations, and the university continued to attract scholars from across the continent. Philip Augustus died in 1223, leaving behind a kingdom vastly different from the one he inherited. He had more than quadrupled the royal domain, established a powerful and centralized administration, and set France on a path to becoming a dominant European power. His reign was a pivotal moment, marking the transition from a fragmented feudal landscape to a more unified and coherent nation-state. He was a king who understood the subtle interplay of power, diplomacy, and military might, and he wielded them with remarkable skill. His grandson, Louis IX, who reigned from 1226 to 1270, would build upon this foundation, not primarily through military conquest, but through a profound commitment to justice, peace, and good governance. Louis IX known to history as Saint Louis, was a king of deep piety and unwavering moral conviction. He ascended the throne as a child, under the regency of his formidable mother, Blanche of Castile, who skillfully navigated the political challenges of the early years of his reign, suppressing baronial revolts and securing the young king's position. Louis IX's reign is often seen as a golden age for medieval France, a period of relative peace and prosperity, marked by significant legal and administrative reforms. Unlike his grandfather, Louis was not primarily a warrior king, though he did lead 2 crusades, which ultimately proved unsuccessful in their military objectives. His true legacy lies in his commitment to justice and his efforts to create the more equitable society. He was renowned for his personal involvement in judicial matters, often holding court under an oak tree at Vincennes, where he would listen to the grievances of his subjects, rich and poor alike, and dispense justice directly. This image, perhaps somewhat romanticized over time, nevertheless captures the essence of his approach to kingship. One of his most significant contributions was the reform of the legal system. He introduced the concept of royal justice, asserting the king's right to hear appeals from feudal courts, thereby undermining the power of local lords and creating a more uniform system of law. He forbade trial by combat within his royal domain, replacing it with more rational judicial procedures involving evidence and testimony. He also established the Parlement de Paris, a high court that would eventually become a powerful judicial body, further centralizing royal authority and ensuring a more consistent application of the law across the kingdom. This move, while seemingly administrative, had profound long-term consequences, slowly but surely eroding the arbitrary power of local lords and creating a more unified legal framework for France. Louis IX's piety was not merely a personal virtue. It profoundly influenced his policies. He was a devout Catholic who believed it was his duty to rule justly in the eyes of God. He founded numerous monasteries and hospitals, and his reign saw the construction of some of France's most magnificent Gothic cathedrals, including the Sainte-Chapelle in Paris, a breathtaking reliquary built to house Christ's crown of thorns, which he acquired from the Byzantine emperor. The sheer artistry and engineering marvel of Sainte-Chapelle, with its soaring stained glass windows, speaks to a king who invested heavily in spiritual and artistic endeavors, not just military might. It is a testament to an age where faith and power were inextricably intertwined, where the earthly king sought to reflect divine order. His foreign policy was largely one of peace, a stark contrast to the expansionist ambitions of his grandfather. He negotiated a lasting peace with England through the Treaty of Paris in 1259, an agreement that saw England formally cede its claims to Normandy, Anjou, Maine, and Poitou, while Louis returned some territories in the south, notably parts of Aquitaine. This treaty, though sometimes criticized for its concessions, brought an end to decades of intermittent conflict and allowed both kingdoms to focus on internal development. It was a pragmatic decision by a king who valued stability over endless warfare. Louis IX's commitment to peace extended beyond his dealings with England. He sought to mediate disputes between other European rulers, earning him a reputation as a wise and impartial arbiter. His efforts to establish a lasting peace in Europe, though ultimately limited by the political realities of the time, demonstrate a vision of kingship that transcended mere territorial gain. He was, in many ways, a moral compass for his era, and his influence radiated far beyond the borders of France. However, even a king as revered as Louis IX faced challenges. The two crusades he led, the Seventh Crusade, 1248 to 1254, and the Eighth Crusade, 1270, were military failures. The Seventh Crusade saw him captured in Egypt, and the Eighth Crusade ended tragically with his death from dysentery in Tunis. These expeditions, while driven by genuine religious fervour, drained royal resources and ultimately achieved little in terms of lasting territorial gains in the Holy Land. Yet even in these failures, his personal courage and unwavering faith were evident, further cementing his image as a saintly king. His canonization in 1297, just 27 years after his death, was a rare and swift recognition of his piety and moral authority, making him the only French king to be declared a saint. The reigns of Philip Augustus and Louis IX represent a crucial period in the formation of the French state. Philip, the shrewd and ambitious conqueror, laid the territorial and administrative groundwork. He transformed the Capetian monarchy from a largely symbolic entity into a formidable power. Louis, the just and pious ruler, built upon this foundation, refining the legal system, promoting peace, and instilling a sense of moral purpose in the monarchy. Together, they created a kingdom that was not only larger and more powerful, but also more centralized, more just, and more self-aware. The administrative reforms of both kings, particularly the establishment of royal courts and the development of a professional bureaucracy, slowly but inexorably chipped away at the power of the feudal nobility. While the great lords still held significant sway, their authority was increasingly circumscribed by the growing reach of the crown. The concept of a unified French kingdom, rather than a mere collection of fiefdoms, began to take root in the collective consciousness. The very language spoken in the royal court, the langue d'oil of the Île-de-France, began to gain prestige and influence over other regional dialects, a subtle yet powerful force in the slow process of national integration. This period also witnessed a flourishing of culture and intellectual life. The University of Paris, nurtured by both kings, became a beacon of learning, attracting scholars from across Europe. Gothic architecture reached its zenith, with magnificent cathedrals rising across the landscape, testaments to both religious devotion and royal patronage. The illuminated manuscripts produced during this era are exquisite examples of artistic skill and painstaking craftsmanship. Their vibrant colours and intricate details preserving stories and knowledge for future generations. The legacy of Philip Augustus and Louis IX was profound. They transformed France from a collection of squabbling feudal territories into a strong, centralized monarchy, laying the foundations for the powerful nation-state that would emerge in the centuries to come. Their reigns solidified the Capetian dynasty's hold on power and established France as a leading player on the European stage. The echoes of their decisions, their reforms, and their visions for France would resonate through the ages, shaping the very identity of the nation. The gentle hum of history, it seems, often finds its melody in the steady, determined efforts of those who dare to dream of a more unified and just world. The 13th century had been a time of consolidation and growing royal power, a golden age for the Capetian dynasty. Yet, as the century drew to a close, the very success of the French monarchy began to sow the seeds of future conflict. Louis IX, the sainted king, had left a legacy of justice and piety, but his successors would face a world increasingly shaped by ambition, shifting alliances, and the inexorable rise of national identity. It was into this complex inheritance that Philip IV, known as Philip the Fair, ascended the throne in 1285. Philip was a king of striking appearance, tall and handsome, with an almost ethereal beauty that belied a steely, unyielding will. He was a man of few words, often described as cold and inscrutable, yet possessed of a keen intellect and a relentless drive to expand the power and prestige of the French crown. Unlike his grandfather, Louis IX, whose piety often guided his political decisions, Philip was a pragmatist, a ruler who understood the emerging complexities of statecraft and finance. He inherited a kingdom that was growing in wealth and population, but also one with burgeoning expenses, particularly for defence and administration. The constant wars with England over Gascony and the need to maintain a strong central government required ever-increasing sums of money. This financial imperative would become a defining feature of Philip's reign and lead him into direct conflict with two of the most powerful institutions of his age, the papacy and the Knights Templar. His first major clash was with Pope Boniface VIII. The dispute began over the king's right to tax the clergy without papal consent, a long-standing point of contention between secular rulers and the church. Philip, desperate for funds, asserted his authority, arguing that the clergy, as subjects of the French crown, should contribute to the defence of the realm. Boniface, a formidable and equally stubborn pontiff, responded with the bull Clericis Laicos in 1296, which forbade lay rulers from taxing the clergy without papal permission, threatening excommunication for those who defied it. The conflict escalated into a bitter war of words and political manoeuvring. Boniface, in his 1302 bull, Unam Sanctum, issued perhaps the most extreme declaration of papal supremacy in history, asserting that it is absolutely necessary for salvation that every human creature be subject to the Roman pontiff. This was a direct challenge to Philip's sovereignty, and the French king was not one to back down. He rallied support among his nobles and the French clergy, painting the Pope as a threat to national stability and even accusing him of heresy. Philip's chief minister, Guillaume de Nogaret, a brilliant but ruthless lawyer, orchestrated a daring plan. In 1303, Nogaret, with a small force, travelled to Anagni, where Boniface was residing, and in a shocking act arrested the Pope. Though Boniface was quickly freed by local townspeople, the humiliation and shock of the event, known as the Outrage of Anagni, proved too much for the elderly pontiff, who died shortly thereafter. This dramatic confrontation marked a significant turning point in the relationship between secular rulers and the papacy, demonstrating the growing power of national monarchies over the universal authority of the Church. It also showed the lengths to which Philip was willing to go to assert his will. The need for funds continued to drive Philip's policies, leading him to target another wealthy and powerful entity, the Knights Templar. The Templars, a military religious order founded in the early 12th century to protect pilgrims in the Holy Land, had evolved into a vast international organization with immense wealth, extensive landholdings, and a sophisticated banking system. They were essentially the bankers of Europe, lending money to kings and nobles, including Philip himself. Their independence, their wealth, and their perceived secrecy made them an object of both admiration and suspicion. By the early 14th century, with the Crusades effectively over and the last Christian strongholds in the Holy Land lost, their original purpose had diminished, leaving them vulnerable to accusations and envy. Philip, deeply in debt to the Templars and perhaps coveting their riches, saw an opportunity. He began to circulate rumors and accusations against the order, claiming they engaged in heresy, idolatry, sodomy, and sacrilegious rituals. On Friday, October 13th, 1307, a date forever associated with misfortune, Philip launched a coordinated, kingdom-wide arrest of all Templars in France. The arrests were carried out with chilling efficiency, catching the unsuspecting knights completely by surprise. What followed was a brutal and systematic campaign of torture and forced confessions. Under duress, many Templars confessed to the outlandish charges, admitting to spitting on the cross, denying Christ, and worshipping an idol known as Baphomet. These confessions, extracted under extreme duress, were then used as evidence to condemn the order. The trials were a travesty of justice, orchestrated by Philip's loyal officials with little regard for due process. The Pope at the time, Clement V, a Frenchman who owed his election to Philip's influence and had moved the papal court to Avignon, was initially hesitant to condemn the order outright. However, under immense pressure from Philip, and faced with the threat of schism and the king's continued accusations, Clement eventually dissolved the Knights Templar in 1312 through the papal bull Vox in Excelso. The last Grand Master of the Templars, Jacques de Molay, along with other senior leaders, initially recanted their forced confessions when brought before a public tribunal. De Molay famously declared that the charges were false and that the order was innocent. For this defiance, he and his companions were condemned as relapsed heretics and burned at the stake in Paris in March 1314. Legend has it that as the flames consumed him, de Molay cursed both Philip IV and Pope Clement V, summoning them to meet him before God within a year. Both men did indeed die within months of de Molay's execution, a coincidence that fueled popular belief in the curse. The vast wealth of the Templars, though technically supposed to be transferred to the Knights Hospitaller, largely ended up in Philip's coffers, providing a temporary solution to his financial woes. The suppression of the Templars remains one of the most controversial and dramatic events of the late Middle Ages, a stark demonstration of royal power triumphing over both religious authority and established institutions. Philip's reign was not solely defined by these conflicts. He also continued the long Capetian tradition of strengthening royal administration. He created a more centralized bureaucracy, developed a system of royal courts, and began to regularize taxation. He also convened the First Estates General in 1302, a representative assembly of the clergy, nobility, and commoners, primarily to garner support for his policies against the Pope. This assembly, though initially a tool for the king, would later evolve into a significant political body in French history. Yet, despite his successes in consolidating royal power, Philip's reign ended on a note of dynastic tragedy. He had three sons, Louis X, Philip V, and Charles IV. All three would rule France, but none would produce a surviving male heir. This lack of male succession would plunge France into a profound crisis. The first to inherit the throne was Louis X, known as Louis the Quarreler, in 1314. His brief reign was marked by continued financial difficulties and noble unrest. He died in 1316, leaving behind a pregnant wife, Clementia of Hungary, and a young daughter, Joan. Clementia gave birth to a son, John I, who was king for only 5 days before his death, making him the shortest reigning monarch in French history. This sudden death of a male heir, so soon after birth, was seen by some as a fulfillment of Jacques de Malay's curse. With no living male heir from Louis X, the question of succession became paramount. For centuries, the Capetian dynasty had enjoyed direct male succession, a seemingly unbroken chain of fathers and sons. The idea of a woman inheriting the throne, or transmitting the right to the throne through her, was largely unprecedented in France. While daughters could inherit fiefs, the crown was seen as a different matter entirely, a sacred trust passed from male to male. The French nobility, fearing the implications of a female ruler or a foreign king through marriage, invoked a principle that would later be codified as Salic law, which explicitly barred women from inheriting the French throne. This principle, though not formally written down as a law at this time, was asserted by the powerful French magnates and legal scholars. Thus, Louis X's younger brother, Philip V, known as Philip the Tall, ascended the throne in 1316. He too reigned for a relatively short period, dying in 1322 without a surviving male heir. His daughters were again bypassed in favour of his youngest brother, Charles IV, known as Charles the Fair. Charles, like his brothers, also failed to produce a male heir, dying in 1328. The death of Charles IV marked the end of the direct line of the Capetian dynasty, which had ruled France for over 300 years, from Hugh Capet in 987. It was an unprecedented crisis. For the first time in centuries, there was no obvious male heir to the French throne. The closest male relative was not a direct Capetian, but Edward III of England, the son of Philip IV's daughter, Isabella. Isabella, often called the she-wolf of France, was a formidable figure in her own right. She had married Edward II of England, a king whose reign was plagued by incompetence and favoritism. Isabella, disgusted by her husband's rule and his relationship with Piers Gaveston and later Hugh Despenser the Younger, eventually orchestrated a coup with her lover Roger Mortimer, leading to Edward II's deposition and murder. She then ruled as regent for her young son, Edward III. Edward III, as Philip IV's grandson through Isabella, laid claim to the French throne. He argued that while a woman might not be able to rule France, she could certainly transmit the right to rule to her male heir. This was a logical argument and one that had precedent in other European monarchies. However, the French nobility, still clinging to the Salic law principle and deeply wary of a foreign king, particularly an English one, rejected Edward's claim. They feared that an English king on the French throne would lead to the loss of French independence and the absorption of their kingdom into England. Instead, they chose Philip VI, a cousin of the last Capetian kings, from the House of Valois, a cadet branch of the Capetian dynasty. Philip VI was the son of Charles of Valois, a younger brother of Philip IV. This decision, to elevate a Valois cousin over the English king's claim, was a pivotal moment. It effectively codified the exclusion of women and their descendants from the French succession, and set the stage for one of the longest and most devastating conflicts in European history, the 100 Years' War. The immediate cause of the war, therefore, was this dynastic dispute over the succession to the French throne in 1328. However, underlying this claim were deeper tensions that had been simmering for centuries. The English kings, ever since William the Conqueror, had held significant territories in France. These lands, particularly Gascony, Aquitaine, were held as fiefs from the French crown, meaning the English king was technically a vassal of the French king for these territories. This feudal relationship was a constant source of friction. The French kings sought to consolidate their control over all of France, while the English kings fiercely defended their continental possessions and their independence from French overlordship. Philip IV, for instance, had engaged in several wars with Edward I of England over Gascony, demonstrating the perennial nature of this conflict. The economic rivalry between the two nations also played a significant role. Flanders, a wealthy region known for its wool production and textile industry, was technically a French fief. However, its economy was deeply intertwined with England, which supplied the raw wool. The French crown's attempts to exert greater control over Flanders often led to rebellions supported by the English, further exacerbating Anglo-French tensions. So, when Edward III formally pressed his claim to the French throne in 1337, after years of diplomatic maneuvering and skirmishes, it was not merely a family squabble. It was the culmination of centuries of territorial disputes, economic competition, and a fundamental clash between two powerful monarchies vying for dominance in Western Europe. The stage was set for a conflict that would redefine the political landscape of France and England, forge national identities, and leave an indelible mark on the medieval world. The fair king, Philip IV, in his ruthless pursuit of royal power and financial stability, had inadvertently laid the groundwork for this epic struggle, his actions and his dynastic failures echoing through the generations that followed. The seeds of conflict, sown in the fertile ground of ambition and necessity, were now ready to blossom into a century of war. The whispers of change that had begun to stir in the courts of France and England grew louder, coalescing into a storm that would rage for over a century. The year was 1337, and the delicate balance of power, always precarious, finally shattered. Edward III of England, grandson of the French King Philip IV through his mother Isabella, laid formal claim to the French throne. It was a bold assertion, rooted in a complex web of feudal loyalties, dynastic ambition, and economic rivalry, particularly over the lucrative wool trade in Flanders, a French vassal state that had strong ties to England. The Capetian direct line had ended with Charles IV in 1328, and the French nobility, invoking Salic law, though its application to royal succession was debated, had chosen Philip VI of Valois, Charles's cousin, over Edward's claim through his mother. This decision, to Edward, was an insult and an opportunity. The initial phase of what would become known as the 100 Years' War saw England, with its highly disciplined archers and innovative tactics, achieve stunning victories that sent shockwaves across Europe. The Battle of Crécy in 1346 was one such moment. Philip VI's much larger French army, a colourful assembly of heavily armoured knights, crossbowmen and foot soldiers, met Edward III's forces on a rolling plain in northern France. The English longbowmen, positioned strategically on a gentle slope, unleashed a devastating hail of arrows, each capable of piercing armour at a distance. The French knights, eager for glory and adhering to older chivalric notions of combat, charged repeatedly into this deadly storm, their horses and riders falling in droves. The battle was a catastrophe for France, marking a turning point in military history and demonstrating the obsolescence of traditional heavy cavalry against massed archers. Among the thousands of French dead was King John of Bohemia, a blind knight who, according to chroniclers, rode into the fray, tied to his companions, seeking a glorious end. Just a decade later, in 1356, the Battle of Poitiers echoed the tragedy of Crécy. Only this time, the stakes were even higher. Edward, the Black Prince, son of Edward III, led the English forces against King John II of France. Again, the longbow proved decisive, and the French nobility suffered immense losses. But the most shocking outcome was the capture of King John II himself. Imagine the scene. The French king, fighting bravely alongside his youngest son, Philip, was surrounded and taken prisoner. This unprecedented event plunged France into a deep political crisis. With their king held captive in England, the realm was left vulnerable, not only to further English incursions, but also to internal strife. The ransom demanded for John II was astronomical, further crippling the French economy. These early English victories were not merely military triumphs, they were psychological blows that deeply impacted French society. The perceived invincibility of the French knight, a cornerstone of their martial identity, was shattered. The common people, already burdened by heavy taxes and the ravages of war, began to question the competence and legitimacy of their rulers. The English strategy of chevauchée, devastating raids across the French countryside, burning crops, looting towns, and terrorizing the populace, was designed to break the French will to resist and to undermine the authority of the French king. These raids left a trail of destruction, turning fertile lands into desolate wastes and forcing communities to abandon their homes. The air, once filled with the scent of blooming orchards, now carried the acrid smell of smoke and despair. Amidst this chaos, France faced another devastating foe, the Black Death. Arriving in the mid-14th century, the plague swept through Europe, indiscriminate in its devastation. It decimated the population, killing an estimated 1/3 to 1/2 of all French inhabitants. The societal fabric, already trained by war, began to fray further. Fields lay fallow for lack of labourers, trade routes were disrupted, and the traditional social order was thrown into disarray. The plague did not distinguish between noble and peasant, though the poor, living in closer quarters and with less access to sanitation, often suffered disproportionately. The sheer scale of death was unimaginable, leaving survivors in a state of profound shock and grief, questioning divine providence and the very foundations of their world. This demographic catastrophe, coupled with the ongoing war, created a period of unparalleled hardship and instability. The capture of King John II of Poitiers led to a power vacuum that unleashed a torrent of internal conflicts. The Dauphin Charles, later Charles V, was left to govern a kingdom in turmoil. The Estates General, a representative assembly of the three orders of French society, clergy, peasants, and gentlemen, general prime, and the same kingdom as Charles V, in their temple. And the Dauphin, later Charles V, was left to govern a kingdom in turmoil. The Estates General, a representative assembly of the three orders of French society, clergy, peasants, and gentlemen. General crime, later Charles V, was left to govern a kingdom in turmoil. The Dauphin Charles, later Charles V, was left to govern a kingdom in turmoil. The Dauphin, later Charles V, was left to govern a kingdom in turmoil. The Estates General, a representative assembly of the three orders of French society, clergy, peasants, and gentlemen. These are all nobility and commoners, attempted to assert more control over royal finances and policy, particularly under the leadership of Etienne Marcel, a wealthy Parisian merchant. Marcel sought to implement reforms that would limit royal power and ensure greater accountability. reflecting a growing discontent with the monarchy's perceived failures. He even led a popular uprising in Paris in 1358, demanding reforms and challenging the Dauphin's authority. This period, known as the Parisian Revolt, saw the Dauphin flee the capital and Marcel effectively seize control of the city. He even went so far as to order the assassination of two of the Dauphin's marshals in front of the Dauphin himself, a shocking act that underscored the depth of the crisis. Marcel's ambitions, however, ultimately outstripped his support, and he was assassinated later that year, allowing the Dauphin to regain control of Paris. Simultaneously, the desperation of the peasantry reached a breaking point. In the spring of 1358, a massive peasant uprising, known as the Jacquerie, erupted in northern France. Fueled by resentment against the nobility, who were seen as failing to protect them from the English and yet continued to demand taxes and services, the peasants rose up in a brutal and often indiscriminate revolt. They attacked castles, murdered nobles and their families, and burned property. The sheer ferocity of the uprising, born of generations of oppression and the immediate horrors of war and plague, shocked the established order. The Jacquerie, though ultimately brutally suppressed by the nobility, leaving thousands of peasants dead, highlighted the deep social tensions simmering beneath the surface of medieval French society. It was a stark reminder that the war was not just a conflict between kings and knights, but a crucible that reshaped the lives of every man, woman, and child. Amidst this backdrop of war, plague, and revolt, a lesser-known but significant event occurred: the rise of the Free Companies. These were mercenary bands, often composed of soldiers who had been discharged after campaigns or who simply sought profit from the chaos. With no loyalty to any particular crown, they roamed the French countryside, preying on the weak, looting, and extorting protection money from villages and towns. They were a law unto themselves, a terrifying manifestation of the breakdown of central authority. Even when a truce was declared between England and France, these companies continued their depredations, making life unbearable for ordinary people. Imagine the fear that gripped a village when the distant sound of trumpets or the sight of unfamiliar banners signaled the approach of one of these companies, knowing that their arrival meant plunder, violence, and ruin. The French crown struggled for decades to control these groups, sometimes even hiring them to fight other free companies, a testament to the complex and often contradictory nature of medieval warfare. Historians still disagree on the precise impact of the Salic Law on the outbreak of the 100 Years' War. While traditionally presented as the direct cause, some scholars argue that Edward III's claim to the French throne was primarily a pretext, a convenient legal justification for a war that was already brewing due to deeper economic and political rivalries. They suggest that had there been no Salic Law, another justification would have been found, as the underlying tensions between the two powerful monarchies were too great to be contained. Others maintain that the exclusion of female succession, a principle that had not been consistently applied to the French throne before this point, was indeed a critical factor, providing Edward with a legitimate, in his eyes, claim, and thus a powerful rallying cry for his nobility. The debate highlights the intricate interplay of legal traditions, dynastic ambitions, and geopolitical realities in shaping historical events. Despite the immense challenges, France slowly began to find its footing. The Dauphin Charles, who had endured the humiliations of the Parisian Revolt and the Jacquerie, emerged as a shrewd and pragmatic ruler. He became King Charles V in 1364, And under his reign, France began a slow but determined recovery. Known as Charles the Wise, he understood the need for fundamental reforms. He reorganized the royal administration, improved finances, and, crucially, reformed the French army. He learned from the English victories, recognizing the importance of disciplined infantry and skilled commanders. He appointed capable generals, such as Bertrand de Guesclin, a Breton knight who, though not of the highest nobility, proved to be a brilliant tactician. De Guesclin employed Fabian tactics, avoiding pitched battles against the superior English archers and instead focusing on sieges, skirmishes, and guerrilla warfare. Slowly wearing down the English presence in France, Charles V also invested in naval power, recognizing the importance of controlling the seas for both trade and defense. He fortified towns and castles, making them more resilient against English sieges. Under his leadership, the French slowly began to reclaim lost territories. The English, despite their earlier triumphs, found themselves increasingly bogged down in a costly and protracted war, their resources stretched thin. The tide of the war, which had seemed to flow so decisively in England's favour, began to turn, subtly at first, like the slow shift of a river's current. The French resilience, though often overlooked in favour of the more dramatic English victories, was a testament to the deep-seated identity of the French kingdom and its people. Even after decades of devastation, the spirit of France, though battered, remained unbroken. The reign of Charles V saw a deliberate effort to restore the prestige and authority of the French monarchy. He commissioned numerous works of art and literature, seeking to project an image of a learned and powerful king. He established the first royal library in France, a testament to his love of scholarship and his desire to centralize knowledge and culture within the court. This cultural revival, even amidst the ongoing conflict, was a deliberate act of nation-building, a way to reassert French identity and pride after years of humiliation. The very stones of the Louvre, which he transformed from a medieval fortress into a royal residence, seemed to whisper of a renewed French grandeur, a quiet defiance against the English claims. The impact of these early phases of the war on French society was profound and long-lasting. It fostered a nascent sense of national identity, as people increasingly identified not just with their local lord or region, but with France itself, a shared experience of suffering and resistance against a common enemy. The war also accelerated social and economic changes. The decline of feudalism, already underway, was hastened by the decimation of the nobility and the rise of mercenary armies. The power of the monarchy, despite the setbacks, ultimately emerged stronger as the need for a centralized authority to prosecute the war became increasingly clear. The devastation of the countryside also led to shifts in agricultural practices and population movements as people sought refuge in fortified towns. The 100 Years' War was not a continuous conflict, but a series of distinct phases, punctuated by truces and periods of relative peace. These lulls, however, often brought little relief to the common people, as the free companies continued their depredations. The memory of Crécy and Poitiers, of the captured king and the ravaged lands, lingered like a persistent shadow over the French psyche. Yet, within this shadow, a new resolve began to form. The initial shock and despair slowly gave way to a hardened determination, a quiet strength born from enduring unimaginable hardship. The French people, through their resilience and the strategic leadership of Charles V, had survived the initial onslaught, and the stage was set for the next dramatic chapter in their long, and tumultuous history. The echoes of battle faded into the quiet hum of recovery, but the scars remained, etched deeply into the landscape and the collective memory of a nation. The year is 1429, and the 100 Years' War, a conflict that had bled France for generations, seemed to be reaching its bitter conclusion. English armies, bolstered by their Burgundian allies, held vast swathes of French territory. Paris itself was under their control, and the Dauphin, Charles VII, the rightful heir to the French throne, was a king without a crown, relegated to the city of Bourges, often derided as the King of Bourges. His court was dispirited, his treasury depleted, and his armies demoralized. The English regent, John of Lancaster, Duke of Bedford, had established a formidable administration in occupied France, and it appeared only a matter of time before the entire kingdom fell under English dominion. Yet from this nadir of French fortunes, a most unlikely figure emerged, one whose story would ignite the flickering embers of French patriotism into a roaring blaze. A young peasant girl named Jeanne d'Arc, or Joan of Arc as she is known to history. Born in the small village of Domremy in the Duchy of Bar, a region that remained loyal to the Armagnac cause, Joan's early life was unremarkable, spent tending to her family's livestock and learning the simple rhythms of rural existence. She was, by all accounts, a devout girl, deeply pious and sensitive to the suffering of her people. From the age of 13, Joan began to experience what she described as divine visions and hear heavenly voices, which she identified as those of Saint Michael, Saint Catherine, and Saint Margaret. These voices, she claimed, instructed her to undertake a sacred mission, to save France from its English oppressors, to see the Dauphin crowned king at Reims, and to drive the English out of the kingdom. It was an extraordinary claim, one that, coming from an illiterate peasant girl, would normally have been dismissed as madness or heresy. Yet the desperation of the times, and perhaps a growing undercurrent of popular belief in prophecy, allowed her message to gain traction. In 1428, Joan travelled to Vaucouleurs, a nearby stronghold still loyal to Charles VII, seeking an audience with the local commander, Robert de Baudricourt. Initially, he scoffed at her, sending her away with a dismissive wave. But Joan was persistent, her conviction unwavering. She returned months later, her reputation having grown through local word of mouth, fueled by predictions she made that seemed to come true, such as a French defeat near Orléans. Baudricourt, perhaps swayed by a combination of curiosity, superstition, and the sheer force of her personality, eventually agreed to send her to Charles VII at Chinon. The journey to Chinon was perilous, a ride through enemy territory disguised as a male soldier. Accompanied by a small escort, upon her arrival in March 1429, Joan faced another formidable challenge, convincing the Dauphin and his skeptical court of her divine mandate. Charles, wary of impostors and perhaps testing her, famously disguised himself among his courtiers. But Joan, unerringly, walked directly to him and addressed him, revealing details of a private prayer he had made, a prayer for divine guidance in his desperate situation. This moment, whether by genuine intuition or a clever prearranged signal, profoundly impacted Charles and his advisors. Still, the Dauphin's council, a mix of theologians and military leaders, remained cautious. Joan was subjected to rigorous interrogations by ecclesiastical authorities in Poitiers. They probed her beliefs, her visions, and her moral character. She answered with remarkable clarity and confidence, often turning their theological questions back on them with simple, profound statements of faith. After weeks of examination, the commission concluded that there was nothing evil in her, only good. Her piety and sincerity, combined with the dire military situation, finally persuaded Charles to put his trust in her. Joan was given a suit of white armor, a banner depicting Christ in majesty, and S. word, reportedly found behind the altar of Sainte Catherine de Fierbois, as she had specifically requested. She was not a trained warrior, yet she rode at the head of the French army, a symbol of hope and divine intervention. Her first major assignment was the relief of Orleans, a strategically vital city that had been under English siege since October 1428. Its fall would have opened the Loire Valley to the English, effectively sealing the fate of Charles VII. The siege of Orleans had been a long and brutal affair, with the French defenders slowly losing ground and morale. When Joan arrived with a convoy of supplies and reinforcements on April 29, 1429, her presence alone had an electrifying effect. She immediately took command, not as a military strategist in the traditional sense, but as an inspirational leader rallying the dispirited French soldiers. She rode through the streets, speaking to the people, and her unwavering faith instilled a new sense of purpose. Over the next few days, Joan led several daring assaults against the English fortifications. Her tactics, though seemingly simple, were effective. She urged her troops to direct frontal attacks, often leading the charge herself, carrying her banner and seemingly impervious to fear. While some historians argue that the French commanders, like Jean de Dunois, were the true military strategists, Joan's presence was undeniably the catalyst. She was wounded by an arrow during one assault, but quickly returned to the fray, further cementing her legend among her troops. On May 8, 1429, after just 9 days of Joan's involvement, the English, demoralized and suffering heavy losses, abandoned the siege of Orleans. This victory, later known as the Miracle of Orleans, was a monumental turning point in the 100 Years' War. It shattered the aura of English invincibility and breathed new life into the French cause. The psychological impact was immense, transforming a war of attrition into a war of liberation. Following Orleans, Joan urged Charles to proceed to Reims for his coronation, a traditional ceremony that would legitimize his claim to the throne in the eyes of God and his people. The journey to Reims was audacious, as the city lay deep within territory held by the English and their Burgundian allies. But Joan's momentum was unstoppable. She led the French army on a campaign through the Loire Valley, capturing towns like Jargeau, Meung-sur-Loire, and Beaugency, and achieving a decisive victory over the English at the Battle of Patay on June 18, 1429. This battle saw the English longbowmen, once the terror of French knights, routed in a swift and overwhelming attack. With the path cleared, Charles VII entered Reims on July 16, 1429, and was crowned king the following day in the city's magnificent cathedral. Joan stood beside him, her banner held high, fulfilling the second part of her divine mission. The coronation was a powerful symbolic act, solidifying Charles's legitimacy and providing a much-needed boost to French national identity. For generations, the French had fought for a king, but now they had a crowned king, anointed by God, with a peasant girl as his divine messenger. However, the euphoria of Reims was short-lived. Joan's desire to press on and capture Paris was met with caution and hesitation from Charles and his advisors. They preferred a more diplomatic approach, seeking a truce with the Duke of Burgundy, rather than risking another direct confrontation. Joan, driven by her voices, saw this as a betrayal of her mission. She led an assault on Paris in September 1429, but it was poorly supported by the royal army and ultimately failed, with Joan again wounded. This failure marked a shift in her fortunes. The court, perhaps growing wary of her influence or simply preferring conventional military strategies, began to marginalize her. Her divine mandate, once so vital, now seemed less convenient. In May 1430, during a skirmish at Compiègne, Joan was captured by Burgundian soldiers while attempting to defend the city. She was sold to the English for a hefty sum of 10,000 livres tournois, a testament to her perceived importance as a symbol of French resistance. The English, eager to discredit Charles VII and break the spirit of the French, put Joan on trial for heresy and witchcraft. The trial, held in Rouen under the authority of Pierre Cauchon, the Bishop of Beauvais, a staunch English partisan, was a political show trial designed to condemn her. Over several months, Joan faced relentless questioning from a panel of learned theologians and jurists. She was accused of wearing men's clothing, a violation of biblical law, of heresy for claiming direct communication with God, and of sorcery. Despite being an uneducated peasant girl, Joan defended herself with remarkable intelligence, courage, and piety. She refused to recant her belief in her voices, asserting their divine origin. Her answers often confounded her accusers, who struggled to find clear evidence of heresy. However, under immense pressure and facing the threat of torture and eternal damnation, she briefly recanted her errors and signed an abjuration. But upon realizing she had effectively denied her voices, she quickly recanted her abjuration, declaring that she would rather die than betray her God. On May 30th, 1431, at the age of just 19, Joan of Arc was burned at the stake in the marketplace of Rouen. Her last words were said to be, "Jesus, Jesus, Jesus," and she asked for a crucifix to be held before her eyes. Her ashes were scattered in the Seine River to prevent any veneration of her remains. Her death was intended to extinguish the flame of French resistance, but ironically, it only cemented her legacy as a martyr and a national heroine. The English victory in executing Joan was a Pyrrhic one. Far from crushing French morale, her martyrdom galvanized it. The French cause, now infused with a sense of divine justice for their martyred saint, gained renewed vigor. Charles VII, though he had done little to save Joan from her captors, eventually recognized the profound impact she had made. 25 years after her death, a retrial, requested by her family and authorized by Pope Calixtus III, posthumously annulled the charges against her, declaring her innocent and a martyr. The tide of the 100 Years' War had undeniably turned with Joan's arrival. While the war would drag on for another 2 decades, the momentum had irrevocably shifted. The French, under Charles VII, began a systematic reconquest of their lost territories. The reforms introduced by Charles, particularly in the military, played a crucial role. He professionalized the army, establishing a standing force of well-trained and well-equipped soldiers, reducing reliance on unreliable feudal levies. This included the creation of the Compagnies d'Ordonnance, a more disciplined and effective fighting force. The English, on the other hand, began to face internal strife and economic difficulties. Their resources were stretched, and their initial advantages in military tactics and leadership began to wane. The longbow, while still a formidable weapon, was no longer the decisive factor it once was against improved French artillery and combined arms tactics. The Battle of Castillon in 1453 is often considered the final battle of the 100 Years' War. It was a decisive French victory, largely due to their effective use of cannons, marking a new era of warfare where gunpowder weapons began to dominate. With the fall of Bordeaux in 1453, the English retained only Calais on the European mainland, effectively ending their claims to vast French territories. The 100 Years' War, which had begun with Edward III's claim to the French throne, concluded with a unified and strengthened French monarchy. The war had forged a distinct French national identity, a sense of shared purpose that transcended regional loyalties, a process that Joan of Arc had so powerfully initiated. The legacy of Joan of Arc is immense. She remains a powerful symbol of courage, faith, and national resilience. Her story has inspired countless artists, writers, and revolutionaries throughout history. She was canonized as a saint by the Catholic Church in 1920, solidifying her place as one of France's most revered figures. Historians, however, still debate the precise nature of her influence. Was she truly a divinely inspired prophet, or a charismatic figure whose unwavering conviction tapped into the deep spiritual and nationalistic sentiments of a desperate populace? Some scholars emphasize the pragmatic military and political factors that contributed to the French victory, arguing that Joan was a catalyst rather than the sole architect of success. Others maintain that her psychological impact, her ability to inspire belief and action in a demoralized army, was indeed miraculous and utterly indispensable. Regardless of the exact balance between divine intervention and human agency, her impact on the course of French history is undeniable. She arrived at a moment of profound despair and, through her extraordinary will and faith, turned the tide of a century-long conflict, setting France on the path to becoming a unified and powerful nation-state. Her story, etched into the very soul of France, reminds us that even in the darkest hours, hope can emerge from the most unexpected places, carried by the most unlikely of heroes. The whispers of her voices, whether divine or born of a fervent heart, echoed across the battlefields, transforming a lost cause into a triumphant rebirth. The long, weary shadow of the 100 Years' War, which had stretched across France for over a century, was finally beginning to recede. By the mid-15th century, the tide had irrevocably turned. Joan of Arc's martyrdom, though tragic, had ignited a fervent sense of national identity, a spark that King Charles VII, once known dismissively as the King of Bourges, skillfully fanned into a roaring flame. The English, despite their earlier stunning victories and their deep entrenchment in Gascony and Normandy, found their hold increasingly precarious. Their internal squabbles, particularly the nascent Wars of the Roses back home, diverted crucial resources and attention away from their continental ambitions. Charles VII, once a hesitant and often indecisive monarch, had matured into a shrewd and effective leader. He understood that the war could not be won by chivalric charges alone. He reformed the royal army, creating a standing professional force of cavalry and artillery, known as the Compagnies d'Ordonnance, in 1445. This was a radical departure from the feudal levies that had often proven unreliable and undisciplined. These new companies, paid directly by the crown, owed their loyalty solely to the king, a crucial step in centralizing royal authority. He also introduced the taille, a direct land tax levied without the consent of the nobility, providing a stable and independent source of royal revenue. This financial independence was a cornerstone of his power, allowing him to fund his armies and administration without constantly begging his fractious vassals. The French forces, revitalized and well-equipped, began to systematically reclaim lost territories. Normandy, long a jewel in the English crown, fell in 1450 after the decisive Battle of Formigny, where French artillery played a pivotal role in shattering the English archer formations. The sound of cannon fire, once a novelty, was becoming the grim soundtrack of modern warfare, signaling the end of the age of the armored knight as the undisputed master of the battlefield. The final act of this long drama unfolded in Gascony, a region that had been English for 3 centuries. Since the marriage of Eleanor of Aquitaine to Henry II, the English, under the venerable Lord Talbot, attempted a last stand at Castillon in 1453. Here, too, French artillery proved devastating. Talbot himself was killed, and the English army was routed. This battle is widely considered the final engagement of the 100 Years' War. With Castillon, only Calais remained in English hands, a solitary outpost on the French coast, a stark reminder of a bygone era. The war, which had ravaged the land, depopulated villages, and brought untold suffering, was finally over. France, though scarred, emerged from the crucible with a newfound sense of unity and a vastly strengthened monarchy. The English, forced to retreat across the Channel, turned inward, their focus shifting to internal dynastic struggles. The dream of a dual monarchy, a single crown uniting England and France, had evaporated like morning mist. The cessation of hostilities ushered in an era of profound transformation for France. The immediate task was recovery and reconstruction. Fields lay fallow, towns were in ruins, and the population had been decimated by war and plague. But with peace came the opportunity to rebuild, and the strengthened monarchy was ideally positioned to lead this effort. The kings of France, no longer needing to constantly defend their very right to rule, could now focus on consolidating their power and shaping a more unified state. Charles VII, having secured his kingdom, devoted his remaining years to internal reforms. He continued to strengthen the royal administration, appointing loyal officials rather than relying on the often rebellious nobility. He encouraged trade and agriculture, recognizing that a prosperous kingdom was a stable one. However, it was his son, Louis XI, who would truly embody the spirit of royal centralization and the emergence of the modern French state. Louis, often called the Spider King due to his cunning and manipulative nature, ascended to the throne in 1461. He was a monarch of a different mold than his chivalrous predecessors. He disdained grand tournaments and battlefield glory, preferring the quiet machinations of diplomacy, espionage, and financial leverage. Louis XI's reign was a relentless campaign to dismantle the remaining vestiges of feudal independence and to weave all of France into a single, cohesive royal tapestry. His primary antagonist was Charles the Bold, Duke of Burgundy, a powerful and ambitious prince whose vast domains stretched from the Low Countries to the Swiss border, rivaling the French crown itself. Charles envisioned a powerful middle kingdom, a new Lotharingia, independent of both France and the Holy Roman Empire. This ambition put him on a direct collision course with Louis. The struggle between Louis and Charles was less about pitched battles and more about a sophisticated game of chess, played with alliances, betrayals, and economic warfare. Louis masterfully employed diplomacy, often playing his enemies against each other. He cultivated alliances with the Swiss, whose formidable mercenary pikemen were a match for any army, and with the cities of the Low Countries, which resented Burgundian heavy taxation. He also understood the power of money. He bribed officials, funded rebellions against Charles, and used his growing royal treasury to his advantage. One lesser-known detail about Louis XI's approach to governance was his extensive use of the postal service. He developed a highly efficient royal postal system, not merely for official correspondence, but also for intelligence gathering. His agents and spies, often disguised as merchants or pilgrims, would use this network to transmit information directly to the king, giving him an unparalleled understanding of events across his kingdom and beyond. This sophisticated intelligence network was a key tool in his centralization efforts, allowing him to anticipate threats and react swiftly. Louis's reign was also marked by his pragmatic approach to justice. He established royal courts and strengthened their authority, gradually eroding the judicial powers of the local lords. He encouraged the development of a professional legal class, men loyal to the crown and trained in Roman law, which emphasized the authority of the sovereign. He also saw the value in the burgeoning urban centers, granting privileges and charters to cities, thus gaining their loyalty and their financial support, often at the expense of the local nobility. The clash with Charles the Bold reached its climax in the 1470s. Charles, in his relentless pursuit of a grander kingdom, overextended himself. He alienated his allies, particularly the Swiss, through his arrogance and aggressive policies. In 1476, the Swiss inflicted two crushing defeats on Charles at Granson and Murat. The following year, at the Battle of Nancy, Charles met his end, falling in battle against a combined force of Swiss and Lorrainers. His body, stripped and frozen, was found days later in a ditch. The death of Charles the Bold was a monumental triumph for Louis XI. Burgundy, a formidable rival for generations, was now ripe for absorption. Louis immediately moved to seize the Burgundian territories, particularly the Duchy of Burgundy itself, which he claimed as a reverted fief of the French crown. The rich and prosperous Low Countries, however, were inherited by Charles's daughter, Mary of Burgundy, who quickly married Maximilian of Habsburg, the future Holy Roman Emperor. This marriage would have profound and long-lasting consequences, creating a powerful Habsburg presence on France's eastern border and setting the stage for centuries of rivalry between France and the Habsburgs. Despite this challenge, Louis XI had achieved his primary goal. The great feudal principalities, Tit had once fragmented France. Anjou, Provence, Maine, and most significantly Burgundy, were either brought directly under royal control or significantly diminished. The map of France at the end of Louis's reign in 1483 looked far more like the modern nation-state than it had at the beginning of the 100 Years' War. The king's authority was paramount, his treasury was full, and his administration was efficient. Historians still debate the true nature of Louis XI's legacy. Was he a ruthless tyrant who crushed dissent and manipulated all for his own gain? Or a visionary statesman who laid the foundations for a strong, unified France? His contemporaries often viewed him with a mixture of fear and grudging respect. He was certainly not a beloved king in the traditional sense. He was pragmatic, often cruel and deeply suspicious. Yet, his policies undeniably transformed France from a collection of semi-independent fiefdoms into a more centralized and powerful kingdom. He understood that the age of feudal chivalry was waning, and the future belonged to strong monarchies, professional armies, and sophisticated diplomacy. The centralization of royal power under Louis XI marked a definitive shift in French history. The feudal contract, where powerful lords owed military service and fealty to the king in exchange for land and autonomy, was gradually being replaced by a system where all subjects, noble and commoner alike, were increasingly beholden to the crown. The king's law became the supreme law, his justice the ultimate justice. This process was not without resistance. The great nobles, accustomed to their traditional independence, chafed under royal authority. Louis faced several rebellions. Most notably, the League of the Public Weal, a coalition of powerful princes who sought to curb his power. But Louis, through a combination of military force, shrewd negotiation, and outright bribery, managed to overcome these challenges. The French language itself began to coalesce during this period. While regional dialects remained strong, the language of the royal court and administration, Parisian French, gained increasing prominence. The invention of the printing press in the mid-15th century, though originating in Germany, quickly spread to France. This technology would prove to be a powerful tool for centralization, allowing for the widespread dissemination of royal decrees, laws, and official documents, further standardizing language and reinforcing the king's authority across the realm. Imagine the quiet hum of the printing press in a Parisian workshop, churning out copies of a new royal ordinance, each sheet a tiny thread in the vast tapestry of national unity. The transformation was not just political and administrative, it was also cultural. The focus shifted from the local lord's castle to the royal court. The king became the ultimate patron of arts and letters, attracting scholars, artists, and architects to his service. While Louis XI himself was more interested in statecraft than aesthetics, his successors would build upon the foundations he laid, creating a magnificent royal culture that would define France for centuries to come. The grand chateaux of the Loire Valley, though mostly built later, were a testament to this new era of royal power and prestige, a visible manifestation of the king's dominion over the land. The 100 Years' War, in its long and destructive course, had paradoxically forged a stronger, more unified France. The shared suffering, the common enemy, and the emergence of figures like Joan of Arc had fostered a nascent sense of national identity, a feeling of being French rather than merely a subject of a particular duke or count. The kings, particularly Charles VII and Louis XI, skillfully harnessed this sentiment, transforming a kingdom perpetually threatened by internal fragmentation and external invasion into a formidable European power. The age of the great feudal magnates, with their semi-independent armies and their vast personal domains, was drawing to a close. The future belonged to the sovereign state, with a centralized government, a standing army, and a unified legal and administrative system. The quiet, calculating genius of Louis XI, more than any other monarch of his era, understood this profound shift. He was a king for a new age, one where cunning and diplomacy often trumped brute force, and where the meticulous management of finances and information was as crucial as military might. As the 15th century drew to a close, France stood on the cusp of a new era. The medieval period, with its intricate web of feudal loyalties and its constant struggles between kings and their vassals was giving way to the early modern period, characterized by powerful nation-states and absolute monarchies. The scars of the 100 Years' War would remain for generations, etched into the landscape and the collective memory, but the kingdom that emerged was stronger, more cohesive, and more distinctly French than ever before. The dreams of a unified French state, once a distant aspiration, had become a tangible reality, a testament to the resilience of a people and the evolving vision of its kings. The whisper of the wind through the newly planted fields, the steady rhythm of the royal courts, and the distant echo of a printing press all spoke of a kingdom reborn, ready to face the challenges and opportunities of a new world. The tapestry of medieval France, woven through centuries of conquest, alliance, and dynastic struggle, was still incomplete as the 15th century dawned. Great swathes of land, nominally under the French crown, operated with a fierce independence, their rulers powerful enough to challenge the king himself. Among these, the Duchy of Burgundy stood as a glittering, formidable rival, a state whose wealth and cultural sophistication often eclipsed that of Paris. The House of Valois-Burgundy, a cadet branch of the French royal family, had, through shrewd marriages and strategic acquisitions, forged an empire that stretched from the Low Countries down to the Swiss border. Philip the Bold, John the Fearless, Philip the Good, and Charles the Bold. These dukes were not mere vassals. They were sovereigns in their own right, patrons of art and learning, commanders of formidable armies, and players on the grand stage of European politics. Their court at Dijon, and later at Brussels and Bruges, rivaled any in splendour. The Order of the Golden Fleece, founded by Philip the Good in 1430, was a testament to their prestige, an elite chivalric order that bound the most powerful nobles of Europe to their cause. The Burgundian lands, particularly Flanders and Brabant, were economic powerhouses, their cities bustling with trade, their looms producing the finest textiles, and their artists shaping the very aesthetics of the Northern Renaissance. This Burgundian state, however, was a geographical anomaly, a collection of disparate territories rather than a unified whole. Its very existence posed a fundamental challenge to the French monarchy's aspiration for a centralized, unified kingdom. The clash was inevitable, and it came to a head under the reign of Louis XI of France and Charles the Bold of Burgundy, often called the Spider King for his cunning and intricate political webs, recognized the existential threat posed by Burgundy. Charles, on the other hand, was a man of boundless ambition, dreaming of a kingdom of his own, a new Lotharingia carved from the heart of Europe. Their rivalry was a chess match, played across battlefields and diplomatic tables. Charles, with his impetuous nature and aggressive expansionist policies, overreached. His attempts to conquer Lorraine and the Swiss cantons led to a series of disastrous campaigns. At the Battle of Nancy in 1477, Charles the Bold met his end, his body found frozen in a ditch, partially eaten by wolves. With his death, the male line of the Valois-Burgundy dukes became extinct. This was Louis XI's moment. He immediately moved to claim the Burgundian territories, arguing that they reverted to the French crown. However, Charles's only heir struggles, an ending challenge beyond anything that wasn't a question. His daughter, Mary of Burgundy, was a valuable prize. Her marriage to Maximilian of Austria, the future Holy Roman Emperor, brought a significant portion of the Burgundian inheritance, particularly the wealthy Low Countries, into the Habsburg sphere. This union would ignite centuries of conflict between France and the Habsburgs, a rivalry that would shape European history for generations. Yet for France, the core Burgundian duchy, including Dijon and the surrounding lands, was successfully absorbed, a crucial step in consolidating royal power and defining the kingdom's eastern borders. The wealth and cultural vibrancy of Burgundy, though now under French control, continued to flourish, adding a new dimension to the French cultural landscape. While Burgundy was a dramatic, high-stakes struggle, the absorption of Brittany was a more protracted, yet equally significant, process. The Duchy of Brittany, situated on the westernmost peninsula of France, had always maintained a fiercely independent identity, its Celtic heritage distinguishing it from the rest of the kingdom. Its dukes, like those of Burgundy, wielded considerable power, often playing England and France against each other to preserve their autonomy. The 15th century saw Brittany caught in a delicate balance. Its strategic location, controlling access to the Atlantic, made it a coveted prize. The French kings, particularly Louis XI and his successors, understood that true national unity could not be achieved as long as Brittany remained a quasi-independent state. The death of Duke Francis II of Brittany in 1488, leaving only his young daughter Anne as heir, presented a critical juncture. Anne of Brittany was one of the most sought-after brides in Europe. Her marriage would determine the fate of the duchy. She initially married Maximilian of Austria by proxy, a move that threatened to encircle France with Habsburg power. However, French military pressure and diplomatic maneuvering, orchestrated by the Regency Council of Charles VIII, Louis XI's son, forced Anne to annul her marriage to Maximilian. In a remarkable turn of events, she was compelled to marry King Charles VIII of France in 1491. This union, though born of political necessity, effectively brought Brittany into the French royal domain. When Charles VIII died childless in 1498, Anne, still young, found herself a widow. The succession laws of Brittany stipulated that if she had no children by the French king, the duchy would revert to her own line. To prevent Brittany from slipping away, the new French king, Louis XII, Charles VIII's cousin, immediately sought her hand in marriage, despite already being married himself. With papal dispensation, Louis divorced his first wife and married Anne in 1499. This second marriage to a French king further cemented Brittany's ties to the crown. Anne, a strong-willed and intelligent woman, fiercely protected Breton interests and identity throughout her life, but the die was cast. Upon Anne's death in 1514, her daughter Claude, who was married to the future King Francis I of France, inherited the duchy. Finally, in 1532, the Act of Union between France and Brittany was signed, formally incorporating the duchy into the Kingdom of France. While Brittany retained some specific rights and privileges for a time, its long history of independence came to an end. The absorption of Brittany, alongside Burgundy, marked the completion of the territorial consolidation of medieval France, creating a more cohesive and geographically defined kingdom. These territorial acquisitions were not merely political or military victories. They had profound cultural repercussions. The vast wealth and artistic traditions of Burgundy, for instance, flowed into the French court, enriching its aesthetic and intellectual life. Burgundian art, with its meticulous detail, vibrant colours, and profound realism, influenced French painters and sculptors. The elaborate courtly rituals and refined manners of the Burgundian dukes also left their mark on the French aristocracy, contributing to the development of a sophisticated court culture that would later define the French monarchy. Similarly, the unique cultural identity of Brittany, though absorbed politically, continued to thrive. Its distinctive language, music, and folklore added to the rich tapestry of French regional cultures, contributing to the diversity that still characterizes France today. The integration of these powerful ducal territories meant that the French crown now presided over a much larger and more diverse population, with varied traditions, dialects, and economic interests. Managing this diversity while simultaneously forging a national identity would be a continuing challenge for the emerging modern state. As these final pieces of the medieval puzzle fell into place, a new era was dawning across Europe. The cultural shifts signaling the approach of the Renaissance were becoming increasingly evident. While the Italian Renaissance had begun much earlier, its influence was now spreading northward, carried by merchants, scholars, and artists. The fall of Constantinople in 1453, though a distant event, sent ripples across the continent as Byzantine scholars fled west, bringing with them ancient Greek texts and a renewed interest in classical learning. In France, this intellectual ferment was beginning to take root. The invention of the printing press by Gutenberg in the mid-15th century revolutionized the dissemination of knowledge. Books, once rare and precious, became more accessible, fostering literacy and the exchange of ideas. French universities, particularly the Sorbonne in Paris, began to embrace new humanistic studies. Moving beyond the scholastic traditions of the High Middle Ages, scholars like Jacques Lefebvre d'Etaples, a prominent French humanist, began to re-examine biblical texts and classical literature, challenging established interpretations and fostering a spirit of critical inquiry. The architectural landscape also began to change. While Gothic cathedrals continued to be built, new influences from Italy, with their emphasis on classical forms, symmetry, and proportion, started to appear in royal chateaux and urban palaces. The Château de Blois, for example, underwent significant renovations in the late 15th and early 16th centuries, blending late Gothic elements with early Renaissance features, a visual testament to the transition. Royal patronage played a crucial role in fostering these cultural shifts. Kings like Charles VIII and Louis XII, and especially Francis I, were captivated by the Italian Renaissance. Charles VIII's campaigns in Italy, though militarily inconclusive, exposed the French nobility to the dazzling art, architecture, and intellectual vibrancy of Florence and Milan. He brought back Italian artists and artisans, seeds that would eventually blossom into the French Renaissance. Louis XII continued this trend, and Francis I, the true Renaissance prince, would later famously invite Leonardo da Vinci to his court, symbolizing the full embrace of this new cultural movement. This period also saw a subtle but significant shift in the concept of kingship. The medieval king, often seen as a feudal overlord and a divine figure, began to evolve into a more centralized administrative ruler. The consolidation of territories, the growth of royal bureaucracy, and the increasing reliance on a standing army rather than feudal levies all contributed to a stronger, more absolute monarchy. The king was no longer just the first among equals. He was increasingly the undisputed head of a unified state. The legal system, too, underwent gradual changes. Roman law, with its emphasis on codified statutes and centralized authority began to gain more prominence, particularly in the south of France, influencing the development of a more coherent national legal framework. While customary law remained strong in many regions, the trend was towards greater legal uniformity and royal jurisdiction. The end of the 15th century and the early decades of the 16th thus represent a pivotal moment in French history. The struggles to absorb Burgundy and Brittany completed the geographical outline of the kingdom, ending centuries of internal fragmentation and establishing the borders that would largely define France for centuries to come. Simultaneously, the intellectual and artistic currents flowing from Italy began to transform French culture, laying the groundwork for the brilliant French Renaissance. The medieval era, with its feudal structures, localized power, and Gothic aesthetics, was slowly giving way to a new age of centralized monarchies, humanistic inquiry, and classical revival. The long, intricate story of medieval France, a narrative of kings and peasants, battles and treaties, faith and ambition, was drawing to a close, seamlessly transitioning into the dawn of the early modern world. The echoes of crusades and chivalry still lingered, but the scent of new ideas was in the air, promising a future shaped by different forces and grander designs. The kingdom, now more complete than ever, stood on the cusp of a profound transformation, ready to embrace the challenges and opportunities of a new age.